Chapter 19. A Chase. Though she knew it was wishful thinking, Nancy flashed the telephone operator and asked her to attempt to trace the call from Hélène, which had been so mysteriously cut off. The operator tried but reported, "The call must have come from a private dial phone. There is no way we can trace it." "Thank you," Nancy said. She sat still for several minutes, pondering the telegram and the phone call. The messages were completely contradictory. One of them was certainly a fake. But which one? "Hannah," said Nancy, after returning to the breakfast table and telling about the call, "I'm going to drive over to Cliffwood and see if I can learn anything about the sender of that telegram." "All right, dear, but do be careful." On the way, Nancy spotted George strolling on the main street and asked her to go along. When Nancy told her about the latest developments in the case, she whistled. "Sounds as if Hélène and Henri really have been kidnapped." Nancy nodded. At the Cliffwood telegraph office, she explained to the clerk that she suspected a hoax. The woman was very cooperative and checked the original message. The sender had refused to give an address. "It was a counter-telegram," she explained. "Written here and paid for in cash, so I have no way of tracing the sender. I do recall that it was filed by a woman, though. Kind of loud in her dress and speech. Does that help you?" "Very much," said Nancy, her mind instantly conjuring up a picture of Mrs. Judson. Nancy went back to the car and relayed the information to George. "I'll bet," said George emphatically, "that this whole business was staged." "In what way?" "Both the telegram and the phone call," George replied, "were sent to frighten you off the case." George chuckled. "But they don't know Nancy Drew and the way she thrives on challenges. But where has this one led us? Into a blind alley." Nancy smiled, then said, "When I run into a dead end on a clue, I go back to the beginning and start all over again." "The beginning?" George repeated. "You mean all the way back to the bisque figurines?" "That's as good a place as any, George." The girls had lunch, then Nancy drove back to River Heights. George left her and Nancy went to her father's office. After telling him of the morning's happenings, she made a request. "Dad, would you please find out from the Customs Service if those bisque figurines were imported? I suspect they may have been shipped to Mr. Duparc as well as the paintings." "I can try," the lawyer readily agreed. Nancy said she would be at the dancing school if he should want her, and headed for the Fontaine studio. She found things running smoothly, with Mrs. Nickerson in charge. Since there were 20 minutes before the next class, Nancy donned a leotard and practiced for her dance in the forthcoming charity show. "That's excellent," Ned's mother commented enthusiastically after watching her. When Nancy's class of young students arrived and had donned their costumes, she began a story she loved of the great ballerina Pavlova. "One of Pavlova's favorite dances," Nancy said, "was called the Swan. It's said she floated across the stage in a filmy white-feathered costume even more gracefully than this lovely bird swims. And how do you think Pavlova learned to imitate it?"
"How?"
chorused the little girls. "In her garden at Ivy House in Hampstead, England," Nancy said. "Pavlova had a small lake with tame swans swimming on it. She used to watch them for hours and sometimes caressed her beautiful white birds and let them fly back to the water. She watched every movement." "Did she have any other pets?" Susie asked. "Yes," said Nancy. "Pavlova had a gorgeous cockatoo that she loved to feed grapes to. By the way, how many of you girls have watched the swans in our own River Heights Park?" All of them raised their hands, and Nancy said, "How about all of you pretending to be swans and using the steps you've been learning?" The children were eager to try it, so Nancy put on a record of the Swan Lake music, and the little girls began to flit around the room, gliding, swimming, diving. When the class was over, Mrs. Nickerson called Nancy to the phone. "It's Ned," she told her, and handed over the instrument. "Hello, Ned." "Hi, Nancy. How about a late afternoon ride and dinner with me? You need a rest from the Fontaine case." Nancy agreed to go. She put on her pink sports dress and helped Mrs. Nickerson with some of the clerical work until Ned arrived. As they pulled away from the curb, she said, "Please, Ned, if it doesn't make any great difference where we go, let's drive to Cliffwood." "Why Cliffwood?" "I suspect Mrs. Judson sent me a telegram from there. Maybe that's where she and her husband are living." Ned groaned in pretended annoyance, but admitted he would enjoy helping Nancy solve at least part of the mystery. Arriving in Cliffwood, he began a patrol of the streets. They had just passed the railroad station and were nearing a big supermarket when Nancy suddenly gripped Ned's arm. "There's Mrs. Judson now, going into that self-service grocery across the street." Ned stopped the car and Nancy jumped out. Traffic was heavy and delayed her. Finally, she crossed to the far side and hurried into the market, which was crowded with shoppers. Nancy looked quickly down one aisle and then the next. By the time she located Mrs. Judson, who was wearing a bright green dress and a white hat, the mystery woman had completed her purchases and was at the checkout counter, paying her bill. The width of the store was between her and Nancy, as well as half-loaded carts in all kinds of awkward positions. Nancy made her way among them as fast as she could, but when she reached the exit, Mrs. Judson was already leaving the store. At the checkout counter, Nancy tried to push her way through the line of carts and customers. An irate cashier looked up and said, "Wait your turn, miss. These customers are in a hurry, too." "I'm not buying anything," Nancy told her, and as several women glowered at her, she finally broke into the clear and headed for the doorway. By the time she reached the street, Mrs. Judson was at the railroad station. Nancy heard a train coming and looked around wildly for Ned. He was not in sight. Nancy raced across the street to the station. As she dashed through the waiting room, she caught sight of Mrs. Judson on the train, which was just pulling out. Nancy had no chance to climb aboard. "But I mustn't lose that woman," she said to herself. As Nancy headed for the taxi stand with the thought of catching the train at the next station, Ned pulled up and called, "Going my way, lady?" Nancy jumped into the car quickly, explained what had happened, and Ned took up the chase. The train was slowing to a stop at Brandon when Nancy left the car and hurried toward the tracks. A moment later, Mrs. Judson alighted and headed for the street. Nancy dashed to her side and grabbed the woman's arm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Judson," she said. "I've been looking for you." Mrs. Judson whirled and tried to break Nancy's grasp, but the young detective held on tightly. In the scuffle which followed, Mrs. Judson's handbag opened. Out tumbled the Scarlet ballet slippers. The stiff toes on them had been pulled apart. Quickly, Nancy concluded that Mrs. Judson might have stolen the slippers because something was secreted in them. She wondered if the woman had found it. At this point, Ned came hurrying up with a policeman. "Arrest this woman!" the young man ordered. "What's the charge?" the officer asked. "The theft of these ballet shoes," Nancy replied. "This woman uses the name of Mrs. Judson, but I don't think that's her right name. Federal authorities are looking for her and her husband in connection with a smuggling racket. These slippers have something to do with it." The policeman was open-mouthed with astonishment. But before he could act, Mrs. Judson screamed, "My husband is no smuggler! This girl is lying to cover herself." What do you mean, ma'am? Mrs. Judson cried defiantly. This Nancy Drew calls herself a detective, but she's a lawbreaker. What makes you say that? The policeman demanded. She accuses my husband and me of being smugglers, when actually she is shielding the real smugglers. Make her tell you where they are. End of chapter 19.